The morning air tasted like pine resin and old snow. March in the Cascades carried that peculiar weight, winter refusing to leave, spring not quite willing to arrive. Daniel Crane pulled his truck into the gravel lot at Thornberry Ridge trailhead just after 6, the engine ticking as it cooled. He was 31, a civil engineer from Portland with a runner's build and a habit of talking to himself on long climbs. His backpack sat beside him on the passenger seat, royal blue with yellow straps, the kind you could spot from a mile away in dense timber. Inside, wrapped carefully in a side pocket, was a yellow bandana his sister had given him for Christmas. A joke about him always getting lost, even with maps. He'd told his girlfriend he'd be back by nightfall. 7 hours up, rest at the summit shelter, 7 hours down. The trail was rated moderate difficult, 16 miles round trip, gaining 3,200 feet. He carried the essentials: water, trail mix, first aid kit, emergency blanket, headlamp, a compass he rarely needed, and clipped to his pack shoulder strap, a Garmin GPS unit he'd bought the previous summer, one of the early consumer models that could store waypoints and track elevation. He liked gadgets. He liked knowing exactly where he was. The device's screen glowed faintly in the pre-dawn darkness, showing his coordinates with satisfying precision. By 6:30, he was half a mile in, boots crunching over patches of crusty snow between exposed sections of trail. Douglas firs towered overhead, their branches heavy and silent. A raven called somewhere upslope, its voice echoing through the cathedral of trees. He passed a wooden sign warning hikers to stay on marked paths. The terrain grew unstable above 4,000 feet, with seasonal rock slides and hidden crevasses in lingering drifts. Daniel snapped a photo of the sign with his film camera, the mechanical shutter click oddly loud in the morning stillness. He didn't know that would be the last image anyone would find. The temperature hovered just above freezing, that knife-edge point where breath crystallizes and fingers start to ache. Daniel pulled on his gloves, the fabric still stiff from cold. He'd done this trail twice before, once in summer and once in early fall. March was a gamble. The guidebook warned about unpredictable conditions, but he'd checked the forecast obsessively. Clear skies, minimal wind, temperatures climbing into the low 40s by afternoon. Perfect weather, or so it seemed. Before we go further, if you're drawn to stories like Daniel's, cases where time bends, where the impossible becomes real, hit subscribe. We bring you these deep investigations every week, and drop a comment. Where are you watching from? It matters more than you think. Geography shapes how we vanish and how we're found. By noon, Daniel should have summited. By sunset, he should have been home, microwaving leftovers and telling his girlfriend about the views. By midnight, she was calling the county sheriff, her voice tight with a fear she couldn't yet name. She described his truck, still parked at Thornberry Ridge, doors locked, no note visible through the windows. She described the blue pack, the GPS unit, his methodical nature, his habit of sticking to plans down to the minute. A ranger drove out at first light and confirmed the vehicle. Inside, nothing seemed disturbed. The keys were gone. Daniel must have taken them. Standard protocol for solo hikers who didn't want their vehicles tampered with. Search and rescue mobilized within hours. A team of 12 volunteers, 2 bloodhounds with graying muzzles and patient eyes, a county helicopter when weather allowed. They worked the main trail first, calling his name into corridors of timber, checking every spur path and overlook. The dogs picked up a scent near mile marker 4, but lost it where the trail crossed a seasonal creek, swollen with melt and running fast over smooth stones. One boot print, possibly his size, appeared in mud beside a fallen log. Then nothing. The forest swallowed evidence the way it swallowed sound. Days became a week. The search radius expanded to neighboring ridges, abandoned mining roads, a network of hunters' cabins that hadn't been used in decades. They found a granola wrapper near the summit shelter, but the brand didn't match what Daniel carried. A hiker reported seeing someone in a blue pack around 9 that morning, heading upward at a steady pace, looking focused. That placed Daniel on schedule, right where he should have been. But no one saw him descend. No one saw him at all after that single sighting. False hope arrived on day 9. A fisherman 40 miles south called in a sighting, a man matching Daniel's description, disoriented, walking along Highway 26 near a rest stop. Deputies responded within 20 minutes, lights flashing, radios crackling with urgent coordination. It was someone else, a transient with no ID and no connection to the case, just another lost soul in a different kind of wilderness. The fisherman had meant well. The family's hope, briefly inflated like a balloon, collapsed harder than before, leaving them even more deflated. By week 3, the official search scaled down. Volunteer shifts grew sporadic as people returned to jobs and families. The weather turned. A late-season storm dumped 18 inches of new snow across the high country, erasing whatever traces might have lingered under a heavy white blanket. Daniel's girlfriend moved back in with her parents in Gresham, unable to stay in the apartment they'd shared. His mother, a retired librarian in Bend with careful handwriting and an archivist's attention to detail, began printing flyers with his photo and vital statistics, posting them in gas stations and trailheads across 3 counties. His father, a quiet man who worked in timber sales and rarely spoke about emotions, started driving the back roads every weekend, scanning ditches and pullouts with binoculars, looking for anything. A scrap of fabric, a glint of metal, a shape that didn't belong. The emotional architecture of disappearance builds slowly, room by room. At first, there's adrenaline, the conviction that action will produce answers, that enough phone calls and search grids will solve the puzzle. Then comes the plateau, where effort no longer yields returns. Phone calls to the sheriff's office go unreturned or get routed to voicemail. The case number becomes a file in a cabinet, then a box in storage. Daniel's family celebrated his 32nd birthday without him, a cake his mother baked and couldn't eat, candles that stayed unlit. They celebrated his 33rd and his 34th. His girlfriend eventually moved to Seattle, unable to stay in a city where every coffee shop and park held his ghost, where she saw his face in strangers on the street. Investigators did what they could with limited resources and a growing caseload. They pulled Daniel's bank records, no activity after the day he vanished, not a single ATM withdrawal or card swipe. His cell phone had pinged a tower near the trailhead that morning at 6:47, then went silent. Either the battery died or the device was destroyed. They interviewed co-workers, friends, extended family, college roommates, anyone who might know something. No financial troubles, no hidden relationships, no history of mental health crises or substance abuse, no gambling debts or legal problems. He'd been planning a summer road trip to Yellowstone with 2 friends. He'd just been promoted to senior project engineer. The Garmin GPS became a strange footnote in the file. Daniel's girlfriend remembered it clearly. He'd charged it the night before, synced it with his laptop to update the base map software. But GPS units in that era didn't have cellular connectivity. They logged coordinates internally, storing breadcrumbs you could download later with a cable. If the unit was still with Daniel, wherever he'd gone, it held a map of his last journey. But without the device, that map was invisible, locked in silicon and plastic somewhere in the wilderness. Years stacked like sediment in a riverbed. Daniel's case joined the archive of the missing, the hikers, the drifters, the late-night drivers who never arrived, the children who stepped away from playgrounds. His mother kept his room unchanged, his engineering textbooks on the shelf gathering dust, his running shoes by the door still laced the way he'd left them. She joined a support group for families of the vanished, people who understood the particular cruelty of not knowing. They met in a church basement on Tuesday evenings, drinking weak coffee from styrofoam cups and talking about ambiguous loss, the grief that can't complete itself. She learned that the human mind struggles with absence more than death. A body provides closure, painful but final. Absence provides only questions that multiply in the dark. Cold cases occasionally resurface when new technology arrives or when someone decides to take another look. In Daniel's file, a detective named Ortega ran his DNA, collected from a toothbrush found in his apartment, through CODIS, the National Database for Criminal Offenders and Missing Persons. No matches. She submitted his dental records to NamUs, the clearinghouse for unidentified remains. No matches. Every few years, when skeletal remains turned up in the Cascades or the Coast Range, she'd compare reports against Daniel's file. Wrong age, wrong height, wrong location, wrong dental work. The mountains kept their secrets locked in stone and soil. 14 years passed. The world changed around Daniel's absence in ways both subtle and profound. Smartphones became ubiquitous, putting GPS technology in every pocket. GPS devices leaped forward. Units now uploaded tracks in real time, sent SOS signals via satellite, allowed friends to follow your progress on a map. Social media created new architectures of searching, crowdsourced efforts that could mobilize thousands with a single share. But Daniel's case remained analog, a pre-digital ghost trapped in the amber of 2003. Then, on a Tuesday in April, a notification appeared on a server in Kansas. Garmin's back-end system, which passively monitored old devices for warranty and recall purposes, flagged an anomaly in its routine sweep. Unit serial number 4472GXR9281, registered to Daniel Crane in June 2003, had connected to a computer and uploaded 14 years of stored waypoints. The data packet was small, automatic, the kind of handshake that happens when you plug a device into a USB port. Someone, somewhere, had powered on Daniel's GPS and connected it to a network. The alert might have been ignored, a bureaucratic blip, an expired device pulled from a drawer during spring cleaning. But Garmin's customer service protocol, updated after a similar case in Nevada, required logging any activity on units tied to missing persons cases. The company had partnered with NamUs years earlier, creating an automatic flagging system. A case manager in Virginia noticed the ping during her morning review and cross-referenced the serial number against active files. 2 hours later, she was on the phone with Detective Ortega, who'd retired from active duty but still consulted on cold cases. The IP address traced to a public library in Wenatchee, Washington, a town of 33,000 people east of the mountains, where orchards covered the hillsides and irrigation canals crisscrossed the valley. Ortega contacted the library director, who pulled security footage from that afternoon. A man in his mid-40s, graying hair, flannel jacket worn but clean, had used computer station 7 for 40 minutes. He'd plugged something into the USB port. The camera angle didn't capture what, but the timestamp matched the Garmin ping exactly. He'd left without checking out any books, walking out the front entrance at 3:47 p.m. Ortega sent a deputy to Wenatchee with a still image from the footage, grainy but clear enough. The library staff recognized him immediately. His name was Alan Porter. He came in twice a week, usually Tuesdays and Thursdays, to use the internet. He was polite, quiet, never caused trouble. He'd browse job sites, check email on a free Gmail account, occasionally look at news. He didn't have a library card. No one knew where he lived, but he'd been coming in for years, maybe 8 or 9. The deputy canvassed nearby businesses with the photo. A cashier at a hardware store knew Alan. He'd bought hand tools, paid cash, didn't make small talk, but always said thank you. A waitress at a diner remembered him ordering the same breakfast special every Sunday, scrambled eggs and wheat toast, black coffee with no sugar. He always left exact change, counting out bills and coins carefully. Someone said he lived out toward the foothills, maybe in one of the old orchards past the irrigation district. 3 days later, a postal carrier who'd been delivering mail in the area for 20 years pointed them to a property on the edge of town, a 10-acre plot with a double-wide trailer and an overgrown cherry orchard. The mailbox had no name, just a number painted in fading black. Mail came in frequently, mostly junk addressed to current resident. Ortega and 2 deputies drove out at dawn on a Saturday, tires crunching on gravel. The trailer looked weathered but maintained, vinyl siding stained by weather but intact. A cord of firewood sat stacked neatly under a blue tarp. A truck from the early 90s sat in the dirt driveway, expired plates from 2009. Alan answered the door before they knocked, as if he'd been watching from the window. He was thin, deeply tanned from outdoor work, his hands calloused and scarred in the way that comes from years of labor. He didn't seem surprised to see them. Ortega introduced herself, explained why they'd come, mentioned the GPS unit and the ping from the library. Alan nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "I was wondering if that would happen," he said. His voice was low, almost resigned, like someone who'd been expecting this conversation. "Come in." Inside, the trailer was sparse but clean. A wood stove in the corner, a couch with a faded quilt, a small kitchen table with 2 chairs. On the table sat Daniel Crane's blue backpack, faded by sun and weather but unmistakable. The yellow straps had turned dingy white. The fabric showed wear at stress points, abraded by rocks and branches. The Garmin GPS unit rested beside it, screen cracked in a spiderweb pattern, but still functional. And next to the GPS, folded carefully, was the yellow bandana, still bright after all these years. Ortega asked the question carefully, keeping her voice neutral. "Are you Daniel Crane?" Alan looked at her for a long moment, his eyes moving between the 3 officers. "I was," he said. The story came out slowly, over hours, with breaks for water and silence. Daniel, Alan, spoke in a flat, factual tone, as if narrating someone else's life or reading from a police report. He'd summited Thornberry Ridge that March morning without incident, reaching the shelter around 11:30. On the descent, around mile marker 6, where the trail curved along a ridge, he'd stepped off trail to photograph a hawk's nest in a snag tree about 20 yards into the forest. The ground gave way. A sinkhole hidden under a thin crust of snow and rotted pine needles, a geological flaw, invisible from above. He fell 15 feet into a narrow ravine, a crack in the earth that shouldn't have been there. He'd broken his left ankle, possibly fractured a rib, judging by the pain when he breathed. Pain came in waves, white and sharp, then settling into a constant throb. He shouted until his voice went hoarse, but the ravine's walls angled in a way that swallowed sound and threw it back at him. His GPS unit had survived the fall, still clipped to his pack. He checked it compulsively, coordinates, elevation, the little arrow marking his position. He was 40 yards from the main trail, according to the device. 40 yards might as well have been 40 miles when you couldn't climb and no one knew to look down. 3 days passed in that ravine. He rationed water from his camelback, ate his trail mix 1 almond at a time, trying to make it last. He heard a helicopter once, distant and mechanical, moving away before he could signal. He tied his emergency blanket to a branch and waved it, but the canopy above was too dense, the silver fabric invisible from the air. On the 4th day, desperate and feverish, he tried to climb out using tree roots as handholds. His ankle gave out halfway up, and he fell again, landing hard on his shoulder. Something shifted in his mind then. A switch flipping from hope to something colder, more primal. By day 6, dehydration and pain had blurred his thinking. Time became elastic, stretching and compressing. He crawled along the ravine's bottom until it widened into a dry creek bed, following it downslope, because water always finds a path. He moved a few yards at a time, resting between efforts. The GPS unit's batteries died on day 8. He left the pack behind eventually, too heavy to drag, but kept the device and the yellow bandana, some irrational part of him believing they mattered, that they were evidence of who he'd been. Ortega asked how he'd survived. Alan said he drank from puddles and snowmelt, ate fiddlehead ferns and dandelion greens, things he'd learned in Boy Scouts decades earlier. He avoided people once he reached civilization. That was the hardest part to explain, the part that made no logical sense. He'd emerged from the wilderness after 3 weeks, half-starved, barely coherent, covered in dirt and his own waste. A logging road led him to a highway. A trucker offered a ride, concerned about this wild-looking man stumbling along the shoulder. But when the trucker asked his name, Alan panicked. He'd been alone so long, the sound of his own identity felt foreign, like a word repeated until it loses meaning. He said the first name that came to him, Alan, a middle name from an uncle he'd barely known, who died when Daniel was 12. The trucker asked if he needed a hospital. Alan said no, just a ride to the next town. Something in his brain had disconnected, the part that knew he should call for help, that should want to go home. The trucker dropped him in Yakima. Alan, still thinking of himself as Daniel, but unable to say it aloud, found a day labor agency. He worked orchards, moving with the seasons, picking apples and cherries and pears. He slept in bunkhouses with other migrant workers, avoided questions, learned to speak Spanish poorly. He told himself he'd go back, call his family, explain what happened. But weeks became months. The longer he waited, the harder it seemed. How do you return from a death? How do you explain that you chose not to, that something in you broke and didn't want to be fixed? A psychologist would later describe it as dissociative fugue, a rare response to trauma where identity fractures and reforms around a different core. Alan knew who he'd been. The memories were intact, sometimes painfully so, but that person felt unreachable, separated by a wall he couldn't name or climb. He kept the GPS unit and eventually returned to the area years later, hiking back to the ravine to salvage the pack when he felt strong enough. He told himself they were proof of what he couldn't articulate. Proof that Daniel Crane had existed, maybe. Proof that the fall had been real. He'd been living as Alan Porter for 14 years. He paid rent in cash, filed no taxes, held no driver's license or credit cards. He existed in the economy's margins, picking up odd jobs, landscaping, warehouse work, seasonal farm labor. He was invisible by design, a ghost in plain sight. The only time he'd risked exposure was that Tuesday at the library, when curiosity overwhelmed caution after years of wondering. He'd wanted to see if the GPS still worked, if the waypoints were still there, if that digital breadcrumb trail through the mountains still existed. They were, hundreds of them, a ghost trail frozen in time, ending at the exact coordinates where he'd fallen into the earth. Ortega asked if he wanted to contact his family. Alan stared at his hands, the scars and calluses that mapped 14 years of physical labor. "I don't know," he said. "What would I even say?" The reunion happened 3 weeks later, arranged through a therapist specializing in trauma and reintegration. Daniel's mother came alone first, meeting him in a neutral office in Bend with soft lighting and comfortable chairs. She'd aged in ways that photographs couldn't capture, lines deeper around her eyes and mouth, hands trembling as she reached for him, her hair completely white now, instead of the salt and pepper he remembered. She didn't ask why. She didn't demand explanations or express anger. She just held him, and he cried for the first time in 14 years, great heaving sobs that shook his entire body. His father came the next day. He brought the running shoes, still by the door where they'd been for over a decade, the laces still tied. He didn't say much at first, just sat beside his son in the same room, and eventually asked about the mountains, the weather, the trees, the specific slope of light through Douglas firs. They talked around the absence, circling it like a fire too hot to touch directly, using the natural world as a bridge back to each other. The legal situation was complex, but ultimately straightforward. Daniel had committed no crime. He'd filed no fraudulent documents, made no false claims for benefits or insurance. He hadn't stolen anyone's identity. He'd simply disappeared, then reappeared. The state of Oregon required updating records. His driver's license had expired in 2004, his social security status showed him as potentially deceased, and a death certificate had been filed in absentia after 7 years at his mother's request for estate purposes. An attorney helped navigate the bureaucracy, filling out forms that had no standard protocol for this situation. Reintegration proved harder than paperwork. Daniel, he was trying to reclaim the name, practicing it in mirrors, moved into a small apartment in Bend, near his parents, but not with them. He attended therapy 3 times a week with a trauma specialist. The psychologist worked on grounding techniques, strategies for managing dissociation triggers. Large crowds overwhelmed him, sending his heart racing and his vision narrowing. Loud noises sent him spiraling back to the ravine. He couldn't use his old phone number. Hearing it ring caused panic attacks, his body remembering calls he'd never been able to answer. He reached out to his ex-girlfriend through a mutual friend who still lived in Portland. She agreed to meet for coffee at a quiet shop away from downtown. It was awkward, painful, like speaking through thick glass. She'd mourned him, attended a memorial service, built a new life from the ruins. She was married now, had a 3-year-old daughter whose laugh reminded Daniel of how life continues regardless. She told him she was glad he was alive, that she'd thought about him often over the years, but couldn't reopen that chapter. He understood. Some doors close permanently, and forcing them open damages what's left of the frame. The yellow bandana became a focal point in therapy. Daniel couldn't explain why he'd kept it through everything. The fall, the wandering, the years of exile. His therapist suggested it represented continuity, a thread connecting his fractured selves. In one session, Daniel finally unfolded it completely, noticing for the first time that his sister had embroidered his initials in one corner, so small he'd never seen them before. He called her that evening. She answered on the first ring, and they talked until sunrise. The Garmin GPS unit ended up in a safe deposit box at a bank in Bend. Daniel couldn't look at it without feeling the ravine's walls close in, the weight of earth pressing down, but he couldn't destroy it either. The waypoints were evidence of a self he was still trying to reconcile, the engineer who'd walked into the mountains confident and whole. His therapist suggested that trauma doesn't erase identity. It fractures it into pieces that reflect different angles. Healing means learning to hold all the pieces without cutting yourself, accepting that some fractures never fully mend. A year after his return, Daniel testified at a conference for search and rescue coordinators in Seattle. He described the fall, the ravine, the psychological unraveling that followed. He emphasized that he'd wanted to be found initially, but something in his wiring had short-circuited, creating a feedback loop of fear and shame. His case led to protocol changes across multiple agencies, more emphasis on psychological first aid for recovered persons, better training for recognizing dissociative states, partnerships between SAR teams and mental health providers. One coordinator told him his story would save lives, and Daniel allowed himself to believe it might mean something. He also worked with NAMUS to improve their GPS alert system, helping develop better protocols for tracking devices associated with missing persons. His device's ping had saved him, in a sense, finally pulling him back from the edge. If that technology could catch one more case, flag one more disappeared person, before they vanish completely into a new identity, the years lost might carry purpose. Daniel never returned to engineering. The thought of reading blueprints and calculating load-bearing capacities felt like remembering someone else's skills. He took a job at a native plant nursery on the outskirts of Bend, working quietly among ferns and seedlings, his hands in soil instead of at a keyboard. The owner, who knew his story, let him work at his own pace, understanding that some days were harder than others. He hiked occasionally, but only on gentle trails with his father or sister, always with a partner, always telling multiple people where he'd be. He learned that some mountains you climb once, and that's enough. The Cascades remained beautiful from a distance. His mother started a small foundation called the Ravine Project, offering financial assistance to families searching for missing loved ones, help with travel expenses, private investigators, reward funds, therapy costs. The name came from Daniel, a reminder that people can fall into invisible places, geographical and psychological, and that finding them requires looking in dimensions we don't always see. She ran it from her dining room table, processing applications and matching donors to cases, turning her grief into something that moved forward. On the anniversary of his return, Daniel drove back to Thornberry Ridge. He didn't hike the trail, he just sat in the parking lot where his truck had been found 14 years earlier, windows down, listening to the wind move through the pines. He thought about the man who'd started up that trail in March 2003, confident and whole, certain he'd be home by dark. He thought about Alan, the ghost he'd become, the name that had sheltered him when his own felt too heavy, and he thought about who he was now. Someone in between, learning to live with both, carrying the yellow bandana in his pocket like a talisman. If you or someone you know is struggling with the aftermath of trauma or disappearance, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Adults offers resources at 1-800-THE-LOST. The Ravine Project provides support at ravineproject.org. Sometimes the way back takes longer than the way out. Sometimes it takes a different trail entirely, one that winds through valleys you never intended to see. But the mountains, patient and indifferent, wait for all of us to find our footing again. They don't judge the path you take. They just stand witness while you figure out how to walk.